What would you do if someone made fun of you in front of hundreds of people just because they thought you weren't good enough? Before we dive into this incredible story, please hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Viral Tales so you never miss stories that touch the heart. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because we absolutely love hearing from you all around the world. Now, let me tell you about a night that changed everything. Marcus Williams was 16 years old, and he couldn't see the world the way you and I do. He was born blind. But Marcus could hear things that most people missed. He could hear the whisper of wind through trees. He could hear when someone was happy or sad just by their footsteps. And most importantly, Marcus could hear music in a way that seemed almost magical. On this particular evening, Marcus stood in the fanciest building he had ever entered. The Crystal Arts Center in New York City was filled with rich people wearing expensive clothes and jewelry that sparkled under the bright lights. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. The floor was so shiny that Marcus could hear his footsteps echo differently than they did on regular floors. Marcus held his white cane tight in his hands. His music teacher, Mr. Jenkins, had brought him here. Mr. Jenkins taught music at Marcus's public school, and he had somehow gotten 2 tickets to this special event. It was a charity concert where famous musicians played piano to raise money. The tickets cost more money than Marcus's mother made in a whole month working at the hospital. Marcus wore his best clothes, a dark blue suit that Mr. Jenkins had helped him pick out from the thrift store. It was a little big on him, but it was clean and neat. His hands were sweaty. He had never been around so many wealthy people before. Richard Beaumont was the star of the evening. He was 45 years old and considered one of the greatest piano players in the entire world. He had played in every major city you could think of: London, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney. People paid hundreds of dollars just to hear him play for 1 hour. He wore a fancy black tuxedo that probably cost more than a used car, and his dark hair was slicked back perfectly. Richard had a smile that looked friendly, but his eyes were cold. Richard had just finished playing a beautiful piece of music. Everyone clapped and cheered. He stood by the grand piano, soaking in all the attention like a plant soaks in sunshine. That's when he noticed Marcus standing near the back of the room with Mr. Jenkins. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't like seeing regular people at these fancy events. To him, this was a place for the wealthy, the talented, the special people, not for some kid from a public school. Richard walked toward Marcus, his expensive shoes clicking on the marble floor. The crowd quieted down, wondering what the famous pianist was doing. Well, Richard said loudly, making sure everyone could hear him. "What do we have here? A young music lover." Mr. Jenkins smiled nervously. "Yes, sir. This is Marcus Williams. He's one of my students. He loves music more than anyone I've ever taught." Richard looked Marcus up and down. He noticed the white cane. He noticed the way Marcus's eyes didn't focus on anything in particular. A mean smile crept across Richard's face. "How wonderful," Richard said, but his voice didn't sound wonderful at all. It sounded like he was making fun of Marcus. "Tell me, young man, do you play piano?" Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, sir, I do." "Oh, this is perfect," Richard announced to the whole room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a young pianist here. Why don't we let him play something for us?" Some people in the crowd laughed quietly. Others looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Eleanor Chun, the woman who organized the event, whispered to her assistant that this didn't seem right. But she didn't stop Richard. After all, Richard Beaumont was the reason they would raise millions of dollars tonight. "You don't tell the star what to do," Richard continued, his voice dripping with fake kindness. "Come on, Marcus. Don't be shy. I'm sure you know some simple songs. Maybe Happy Birthday? Or Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Marcus felt his cheeks burn hot. He knew what was happening. Richard was making fun of him. Richard thought that because Marcus was blind and young and from a poor school, he must not be very good at piano. Mr. Jenkins put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "We don't have to do this," he whispered. But something inside Marcus shifted. All those hours practicing in the church basement. All those times kids at school called him names. All those moments when people treated him like he was helpless just because he couldn't see. All of it came rushing back. Marcus took a deep breath. His fingers relaxed on his cane. When he spoke, his voice was calm and steady. Actually, Marcus said clearly, I prefer to play Bach. Richard laughed out loud. Bach? Really? Which Bach piece do you know, young man? Marcus tilted his head slightly. The Partita No. 2 in C minor. But maybe that's too difficult for tonight. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that shiny floor. The Partita No. 2 in C minor was one of the hardest piano pieces ever written. Professional pianists who had played for 20 years still struggled with it. It was fast, complicated, and required both perfect technique and deep emotion. Richard's smile froze on his face. Too difficult? Too difficult for whom? For the audience, Marcus said simply, it's a very complex piece. I wouldn't want to bore anyone. Now, people weren't just uncomfortable. They were shocked. Who was this blind kid who dared suggest that these wealthy music lovers couldn't appreciate good music? Richard felt anger rise in his chest. How dare this boy embarrass him? How dare he act superior? I think you don't understand where you are, young man, Richard said, his voice sharp now. You're speaking to people who support the greatest orchestras in the world. People who have forgotten more about music than you'll ever know. Marcus said nothing. He just stood there, calm as a lake on a windless day. Dr. Benjamin Foster, who conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra, stood up from his seat. Richard, perhaps we should move on with the program. No, Richard said firmly. He walked to the piano and played the opening bars of Partita with big, dramatic movements. You see, Marcus, this piece requires not just fingers on keys. It requires maturity, wisdom, years of experience. Are you sure you want to embarrass yourself in front of all these people? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. I'm sure, he said. And with his cane tapping gently on the floor, Marcus began walking toward the piano. Marcus reached the piano bench and carefully folded his white cane. He set it down beside him with the kind of care you use when putting down something precious. Mr. Jenkins helped guide him to sit in exactly the right position. The piano bench was smooth and cold under Marcus's legs. Richard Beaumont stood off to the side with his arms crossed. That means smile still on his face. He was certain he was about to watch this boy fail miserably. Then everyone would see that Richard had been right all along. Some people just didn't belong in places like this. Marcus sat very still for a moment. He lifted his hands and held them over the keys without touching them. The whole room was silent. People had stopped whispering. They had stopped moving. Everyone was watching this blind teenager at the grand piano. Then Marcus's fingers touched the keys. The first notes came out soft and gentle, like the beginning of a story. But there was something different about the way Marcus played, something that made people lean forward in their seats. The notes weren't just sounds. They were alive. Marcus's hands began to move faster. His fingers danced across the keys like they knew exactly where to go, like they had their own eyes. The music started to build, getting more complicated and more beautiful with each passing second. Richard's smile began to fade, his arms uncrossed. He took a step closer to the piano, his eyes going wide. This wasn't possible. This boy wasn't just playing the partita. He was playing it perfectly. The music filled every corner of that huge room. It bounced off the crystal chandeliers. It wrapped around the fancy columns. It found its way into the hearts of every single person there. Some of the music was fast and exciting, like a horse galloping across a field. Other parts were slow and sad, like saying goodbye to someone you love. Mrs. Eleanor Chen felt tears forming in her eyes. She had heard this piece played by masters all over the world, but she had never heard it sound like this. There was something raw and honest in the way Marcus played. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply sharing what he felt deep in his soul. Marcus's whole body moved with the music. His head swayed gently. His shoulders rose and fell with the rhythm. Even though he couldn't see the piano, he knew it better than most people know their own homes. Every key, every sound, every possibility. The difficult parts that made professional pianists sweat and struggle seemed easy under Marcus's fingers. His left hand and right hand played completely different rhythms at the same time, weaving together like two rivers becoming one. The speed of his fingers was breathtaking. They moved so fast they were almost a blur, but every single note was clear and perfect. Richard felt something heavy settling in his stomach. It was shame. Deep, burning shame. He had made fun of this boy. He had tried to humiliate him in front of hundreds of people. And now this boy was showing everyone what real talent looked like. Dr. Benjamin Foster sat forward in his chair, his mouth slightly open. He had conducted orchestras playing this piece dozens of times. He knew every note, every challenge, every place where even great pianists made tiny mistakes. Marcus wasn't making any mistakes. Not one. The music grew more intense. Marcus's fingers pounded the keys with power and passion. The piano seemed to roar like a lion. Then suddenly, the music became soft again, tender and sweet like a mother's lullaby. Marcus was telling a story with his playing, a story about struggle and pain and beauty and hope. People in the audience had completely forgotten where they were. They forgot about their expensive jewelry and fancy clothes. They forgot about their important jobs and big bank accounts. All they could do was listen and feel. An elderly woman named Grace Patterson, who had been attending concerts for over 60 years, wiped tears from her wrinkled cheeks. She had never believed in miracles, but this felt like witnessing one. How could someone so young play with such wisdom? How could someone who had never seen a piano with his eyes understand it so deeply? The music moved through different emotions, like weather changing through the seasons. Sometimes it was angry, like thunder during a storm. Sometimes it was joyful, like children laughing in a playground. Sometimes it was lonely, like being the only person awake in the middle of the night. And through it all, Marcus played with complete confidence, complete mastery. Richard Beaumont felt his legs go weak. He found a chair and sat down heavily. He had spent his entire life becoming the best pianist he could be. He had practiced for hours every single day since he was 5 years old. He had won competitions. He had impressed critics. He had played for presidents and queens. But in all those years, with all that training and all that praise, Richard had never played like this. This wasn't just technical skill. This was something deeper. This was pure, unfiltered music coming straight from the heart. Marcus wasn't thinking about the notes. He was feeling them. He was living them. Mr. Jenkins stood against the back wall with tears streaming down his face. He had always known Marcus was special. He had heard the boy practice in the church basement. But even he didn't realize Marcus was this extraordinary. This was genius. True, undeniable genius. The music built toward its final crescendo. Marcus's hands flew across the keys with incredible speed and power. The piano sang and shouted and whispered all at once. Every person in that room felt the music in their bones, in their blood, in their breath. And then, with one final, perfect chord, Marcus finished. His hands lifted off keys and rested in his lap. He sat very still, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. Sweat had formed on his forehead. His fingers trembled slightly from the effort. The room was absolutely silent. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if the whole world had stopped spinning. Then someone started to clap. It was Dr. Benjamin Foster. He stood up from his seat and applauded, his hands coming together hard and fast. Then Mrs. Eleanorchin stood up and clapped. Then Grace Patterson. Then someone else. And someone else. Within seconds, every single person in that enormous room was on their feet, clapping and cheering like they had never cheered before. The sound was deafening. It echoed off the walls and ceiling like thunder. People were crying openly now. They were shouting bravo and magnificent. Some were hugging each other. A few were just standing there with their hands over their hearts, too overwhelmed to even applaud. Marcus sat at the piano bench, his head tilted slightly as he listened to the applause. A small, humble smile appeared on his face. He hadn't played to prove anything to Richard Beaumont. He had played because music was who he was. Music was his language, his voice, his way of touching the world that he couldn't see. Richard Beaumont remained in his chair, not clapping. His face had gone pale. His hands gripped the armrest tightly. He stared at Marcus with an expression that mixed shock, shame, and something else. Something like respect fighting its way through the pride and arrogance. The standing ovation continued for 5 full minutes. People didn't want to stop clapping. They didn't want this moment to end. They had witnessed something truly special, something they would tell their grandchildren about someday. Marcus finally stood up, picked up his white cane, and gave a small bow toward where he sensed the audience was standing. The cheering grew even louder. Mr. Jenkins rushed forward to help Marcus down from the platform, his own face wet with happy tears. As Marcus walked past Richard Beaumont, he paused for just a moment. Richard looked up at him, and their eyes met even though Marcus couldn't really see him. In that brief moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a truth. Talent doesn't care about what you look like. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor. It doesn't care if you can see or not. Real talent comes from somewhere deep inside, from a place that has nothing to do with what the world thinks you should be. And Richard Beaumont finally understood that he had learned more in the last 10 minutes than in his entire 45 years of life. The applause finally began to fade, but the energy in the room still buzzed like electricity. People were talking excitedly to each other, their voices high and animated. Nobody could believe what they had just witnessed. Marcus stood quietly beside Mr. Jenkins, his white cane in his hand, looking small and humble despite what he had just done. Mrs. Ellen Orchin walked quickly across the room toward Marcus. Her high heels clicked on the marble floor. When she reached him, she gently took his hand in both of hers. "Young man," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "that was the most beautiful thing I have heard in my entire life. Where did you learn to play like that?" Marcus's cheeks turned red. He wasn't used to so much attention. "I practice at St. Mary's Church, ma'am. They let me use their old keyboard in the basement." A keyboard? Dr. Benjamin Foster had joined them now, along with several other important music people. "You mean you don't even practice on a real piano?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. We can't afford one. The keyboard only has 66 keys instead of 88, and some of the keys stick. But Mr. Jenkins lets me use it whenever I want." The crowd around Marcus grew larger. Everyone wanted to know more about this mysterious boy who had appeared out of nowhere and played like an angel. "How long have you been playing?" asked Grace Patterson, the elderly woman who had cried during the performance. "Since I was 3, Marcus said softly. "My grandmother had an old piano. I would sit on her lap and touch the keys. She said I could hear a song once and play it back perfectly. She called it my gift from God." Mr. Jenkins spoke up, his voice proud. "Marcus practices 8 hours every day. Before school, during lunch, after school, and on weekends. He listens to recordings of the great masters and learns the pieces by ear, every single note. He's never read sheet music because, well, he can't see it. He learns everything by listening." Someone gasped. "That's impossible." "I thought it was impossible too," Mr. Jenkins said. "But Marcus hears music differently than we do. He once told me that when he listens to a piece, he can see it in his mind, not with pictures, but with feelings and colors and shapes. He understands music in a way that most of us never will." Richard Beaumont had been standing away from the crowd, but now he slowly walked forward. People stepped aside to let him through. The room grew quiet again. Everyone wanted to see what the famous pianist would say. Richard stopped in front of Marcus. For a long moment, he just stood there. His face showed the war happening inside him. Pride fighting with humility. Ego battling with truth. Finally, Richard spoke. "Marcus," he said, and his voice was different now. The meanness was gone. The arrogance had disappeared. "I owe you an apology. A deep, sincere apology." Marcus tilted his head, listening carefully. Richard continued, and now everyone could hear the shame in his words. "I treated you terribly tonight. I made fun of you. I tried to embarrass you in front of all these people. I did it because I thought I was better than you. I thought that because I had money and fame and awards, that made me superior." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "But you just taught me the most important lesson of my life. You showed me that real talent, real artistry, has nothing to do with what you have or what you look like. It comes from here." He placed his hand over his heart. And you have more of it in your little finger than I have in my entire body. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Some were crying again, but for a different reason now. I have played piano for 40 years, Richard said. I have won every award. I have played in every great concert hall on earth. But tonight, I realized something. I've been playing the notes, but you've been playing the music. There's a big difference. Marcus didn't say anything for a moment. Then he smiled, a gentle, forgiving smile. Thank you, Mr. Beaumont. That means a lot. Richard shook his head. Please call me Richard. And thank you for showing me what I had forgotten. Why I started playing piano in the first place. It wasn't for fame or money. It was for this. He gestured around the room. For touching people's hearts. For making them feel something real. Mrs. Eleanor Chin stepped forward again. Marcus, I want to offer you something. The Crystal Arts Foundation has a scholarship program. We pay for young, talented musicians to study at the finest music schools in the country. We'll provide you with a real piano, a teacher, everything you need. Would you accept? Marcus's mouth fell open. Really? You mean it? I've never meant anything more in my life, Mrs. Chin said firmly. Talent like yours comes along once in a generation, maybe once in a lifetime. We would be honored to support you. Dr. Foster added, and I would like to invite you before with the Philadelphia Orchestra next season. We'll feature you as our guest soloist. How does that sound? Marcus looked overwhelmed. Tears started rolling down his cheeks. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Mr. Jenkins whispered, squeezing his shoulder. Yes, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. What happened next was like a flood breaking through a dam. Person after person came forward with offers. A famous music school wanted him to audition. A recording company wanted to make an album of him playing. A wealthy businessman offered to buy him a grand piano, like the one he had just played. Another woman offered to pay for special technology that would help him learn music even faster. Richard Beaumont watched all of this happening, and something changed in his face. The hardness that had been there before was gone. In its place was something softer, something human. He waited until the crowd had thinned a bit, then approached Marcus one more time. Marcus, I'd like to offer you something too, if you'll accept it. What's that, sir? I mean, Richard. I'd like to teach you, personally, free of charge. Once a week, we'll work together on technique, on expression, on everything I've learned over the years. You're already better than I am in many ways, but maybe I can still share some things that might help you. Richard's voice was humble now, genuinely humble. Would you let me do that? It would be an honor. Marcus's face lit up with the biggest smile. Really? You do that for me? I'd do it for the music, Richard said, and to remind myself of what really matters. You'll actually be teaching me as much as I teach you. 3 months later, Marcus Williams performed at Carnegie Hall, one of the most famous concert halls in the entire world. The show sold out in less than 2 hours. People stood in line for blocks, hoping to get last-minute tickets. News reporters came from different countries to cover the story. On the night of the concert, Marcus walked onto that big stage wearing a brand-new tuxedo. He had his white cane, but he didn't need Mr. Jenkins to guide him anymore. He had practiced on that stage and knew exactly where everything was. In the front row sat his mother, who had worked double shifts at the hospital to support his dream. Beside her was his grandmother, who had first put his tiny hands on piano keys when he was just a baby. Mr. Jenkins sat there too, crying happy tears before Marcus even played a single note. And in the third row, right in the middle, sat Richard Beaumont. He wasn't there as a famous pianist. He was there as Marcus's teacher, his friend, and the man who had learned that sometimes the greatest gift in life is discovering that you still have so much to learn. Marcus sat down at the beautiful grand piano. The lights dimmed. The audience became silent. And when Marcus's fingers touched those keys, the music that poured out was so beautiful, so pure, so honest, that it reminded every single person in that hall of something important. Never judge someone by what you see on the outside. Never assume you know what someone can or cannot do. And never, ever make fun of someone just because they're different from you. Because sometimes the person you underestimate, the person you think isn't good enough, the person you try to humiliate, might just be the one who ends up teaching you the most important lesson of your life. Marcus played that night like he had played at the Crystal Art Center. Not to prove anything, not to show off, but simply because music was his gift, his voice, his way of sharing love with a world he couldn't see but understood better than most people who could. And when he finished, the applause lasted so long that Marcus thought it might never end. But he didn't mind. He just sat there, smiling his gentle smile, grateful for a world that had finally stopped judging him for what he couldn't do and started celebrating him for what he could. Richard Beaumont stood and applauded louder than anyone, with tears streaming down his face, grateful that a blind 16-year-old boy had opened his eyes to what really matters in life. And that's how a moment of cruelty became a moment of transformation, how mockery became miracle, and how one boy's unbelievable gift reminded everyone that the most beautiful things in life are often found in the most unexpected places.